What's going on, everyone? This is Erik from Full Mount MMA. Earlier this week, I actually had the opportunity to interview Ariel Helwani for a school assignment for one of my journalism finals. Our project was to interview a journalist that we have a lot of admiration for, and Ariel was nice enough to give me some of his time. So this is a little bit different from most of the interviews that we have on the channel, but I wanted to share it with you all anyway because I thought we had a really interesting conversation. So I hope you enjoy. You're probably the most influential person to ever cover the MMA beat. What kinds of things did you do while in college to maximize your odds at success?
Well, when I got to Syracuse, originally I just wanted to be, and you can hear me, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I just wanted to be, your traditional broadcaster. I grew up watching sports on television and admiring these guys from afar, guys like Marv Albert and Bob Costas, who were, the cream of the crop back then. And when I got to Syracuse, they kind of tell you what are the things you need to do in order to put yourself in the best spot to get jobs upon graduating so that you can follow in their footsteps. So they had a student station there called WAER where, everyone goes through and you can call basketball games and lacrosse and you do like news updates and stuff like that. And I did that for one semester, but I really didn't like it because it was a little too rigid for me and it felt a bit like a country club. And so I went, so there was kind of three stations on campus. There was WAR, which was the sports one. There was Z89, which was like a rock channel. And I did work there too. And then there was WERW, which was basically, walk into the student station and put your name in a time slot and you could do whatever the hell you want. And that one really excited me because I wanted to do whatever I wanted and I wanted to have a combat sports show. And I did that for 3 years. And it's it's like the same kind of show that I do now. Obviously, now a lot more people are watching and listening, and the guests are a bit bigger, but it really did prepare me for doing this job, booking the guests, thinking of what kind of show would be best for the audience that at the time was non-existent. And so I really feel like doing that every week and being committed to it every week, and sticking with it really set me up for now.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, student media. I mean, they always nail that into our heads at DePaul is so important.
Yeah, it's huge.
I was curious, was it always sports journalism for you? Was there any ever consideration to cover something outside of sports? Anything else you were ever interested in?
No, it was always sports. I mean, I have interest in doing other stuff now, and I'm certainly interested in other things, but nothing was more appealing to me, and there was nothing I was more passionate about than sports. Not, I like the characters, I like the stories, I like the build up, I love all that stuff. So yeah, I never there was never a moment where I was like, oh, maybe I'll get into politics or anything like that. It was always sports for me.
Okay. And why MMA specifically? I know you talked about there was a lack of professional coverage, but was it more that you saw the opening, or was it that you were just that much more in love with mixed martial arts as a sport than other sports at the time?
It was kind of a mix of everything. I mean, there was an opening. There weren't enough people covering it. I felt like it was going to get a lot more popular, but I had a passion for it too. Like I couldn't fake that, right? And I really felt like the stories were interesting, the fights were interesting, the fighters were interesting, the business was interesting. Everything about it was very fresh and new. And how often in your life can you cover something that was, essentially born while you were alive? NFL, NBA, NHL, these leagues, these sports have been around for a century. So it felt very fresh and very new. And I always enjoyed the fight game. I always found the fight game to be really interesting. Whether it's boxing, whether it's pro wrestling, like all these things, combat sports to me and the characters involved in combat sports was really, really appealing. And so it just felt like I was a basketball fan. I was a baseball fan. When I really put my eggs in the MMA basket, my favorite baseball team, the Montreal Expos, moved to Washington, and that made me a little jaded towards team sports for a minute. Because like in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, I'm a big Knicks fan, a big Bills fan, and a a big Expos fan, and the Knicks were a joke, the Bills were a joke, and then my baseball team left. And so there was a moment where I was like, man, team sports kind of sucks, and I just want to focus on this other stuff. And luckily I did.
As a Dolphins fan, I can relate, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yes. Yes.
You started your first MMA website, jerrypark.com, shortly after leaving Spike TV. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, 2007.
You gave yourself just 6 months to succeed. I was curious how you went from starting a website basically from scratch to getting hired in just 6 months. I always thought that was a pretty impressive part of your story.
Yeah, well, it felt like an eternity while I was living it. I felt like I had to give myself a deadline, because if I didn't, I'm just going to be like stuck in this thing. And I kind of believe in, you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And so 6 months felt like a fair amount of time. I wasn't making any money off of it. And so I started in October, and once I got to March, I really started to, I don't want to say lose hope, but there was just not that many jobs out there. So I actually started to look at jobs in TV production again, because I felt like it was inevitable that I was going to have to go back. And luckily, with 3 days left on my deadline, I was playing on a basketball team, and there was a guy on the team who was a lawyer, and he said he got an email about this website starting up from the Wasserman Media Group, which was, I guess, one of their clients, and they're a big like marketing agency. And he threw my name in the hat because he knew I was doing this thing. And then shortly thereafter, one of the guys called me and said he saw my stuff and said, he was interested in hiring me to basically run the website. And I couldn't believe it, because they were going to pay me really well, and they were kind of let me do whatever I wanted. And it just felt like a dream come true. So yeah, 6 months, I guess in retrospect, doesn't feel like a long time, but while I was doing it, it felt like a really long time.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned your backup plan there was to go back into TV production. Was that more of like a behind the scenes role that you might have taken in this alternate reality here where it didn't take off?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
because I was doing that before I went and did the website. When I graduated from Syracuse, I worked at HBO Sports for a year and change in their sports documentary department. At the time, they were kind of known as the best. 30 for 30 wasn't a thing. And then I worked on a TV show, and I just kind of had settled in this groove where I'm going to be the producer guy. And I was kind of okay with that. But there was always this part of me in the back who felt like I could be on camera, or I could be a journalist, I could be front facing. But it's really hard to kind of break in when you don't really have that kind of experience. You don't have a reel. I didn't have anything like that. So if the website thing would have failed, I would, I knew enough people behind the scenes to where I could have gotten something as a writer or producer or something like that.
Okay, I understand. And I'm just curious, when you, of course, it all did work out. You did end up being in front of the camera, being a broadcast journalist. What was kind of the ceiling that you saw at the time in the MMA space? I think most people would argue now that you have kind of become the ceiling of the MMA beat in terms of being a journalist. But back when you were starting out, it was much more of a Wild West media space. There wasn't a lot of natural progression. Still isn't to an extent, but there's more jobs out there. So what was kind of the ceiling that you saw at the time? Where could you see yourself and being like, oh, I made it?
Yeah, and thank you for that. I appreciate it. What I told my parents was I want to be the Howard Cosell of MMA, and that's a pretty damn high ceiling, and I don't think it's attainable. If I'm being honest, at this point. But Howard started his career in his early 40s, so I'm not even there yet. So I just wanted to be known as the voice, the guy. The structure of this sport is a lot different than how it was in the 70s when he was on television. You can't be on the broadcast unless you work for the promotion and stuff like that. And that was always an issue for me. But nevertheless, I do feel like I've been able to like carve out this voice and this niche for myself. So yeah, I just, the ceiling was just to be the face of it. The voice, the face, the top guy. I wanted to be the best, and I wanted people to view me as the most reliable and trusted source in this sport. So that's what I was striving for.
I think you've certainly done that to an extent. When did you kind of realize that maybe you have reached your goal, like you have become that guy? Was there like an interview that you got, or maybe a story that you wrote where you're like, wow, I really can't believe that I get to be the one to report on this right now?
Um, there have been moments, if I'm being honest, I don't feel like I'm there yet. Honestly, that's not just me being like false humble. I really don't feel like I'm there. There obviously have been great moments, like the Strike Force sale was a pretty big moment. The WEC merger was a big moment. Things like that were big. Getting the ESPN job felt really big because it felt like, wow, obviously ESPN is the worldwide leader, and they're hiring me to cover MMA. That felt like a real accomplishment, especially because they wouldn't really look in my direction for a very long time for whatever reason, and it felt like I finally got their attention and broke through. So I was very proud of that. Um, yeah, and like the stuff that I'm doing now was really big. Getting to do the Jake Paul Woodley fight felt like a really big deal. So I still feel like I'm, crossing off things off the list, but I don't feel like I'm there quite yet.
I got you. I got you. Do you think that it's easier or harder now to break into the MMA beat as a journalist? Obviously, there's more opportunities out there since the sport is growing, but there's not, the UFC doesn't quite have the competition that it did back in the day, so it's a little harder to get press credentials. There's obviously a lot more people that want to be MMA journalists now. So what are your thoughts on that?
Honestly, I think it's easier because, as you said, there are more places. The sport is more mainstream. Obviously, there's a little more competition, but there's still, like there's UFC, there's Bellator, there's PFL. That's just in the States alone.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I was coming up, it was obviously UFC who didn't credential anyone unless you were like an established name. And then you had like Strike Force, Elite XC, IFL. So it was kind of the same amount. And then you had the stuff overseas too. So I just think there's more opportunities. There's more platforms. There's Instagram, there's Twitter, there's all these things that Facebook wasn't even a thing when I started. There's a chance to kind of break through and be different. And there's obviously people looking for young people to work. So I would argue that it's actually easier. You just have to, and there's never been more MMA out there. You just have to, look around and see, who's doing what, and try not to copy everyone. Because, sometimes I'll get messages from people being like, oh, I want to break through, and this is what I did. And it's like, a recap of a Bellator event. And there's really not a huge demand for that. You've got to look at the landscape and see what everyone's doing, and then see where there's an opening for you. So that all being said, I would actually argue it's easier now because the job and the sport are more established.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that kind of transitions nicely into some of the more ethics related questions I have here. The UFC, as you've mentioned, is they were not quick to give out press credentials back in the day. I would say they're still more anti-media than a lot of other mainstream sports leagues are, and you could tell that rubs off on the fans as well. They always like to talk about the state of MMA journalism, regardless of the reality. Why do you think the UFC and MMA kind of as a sport isn't as receptive to our sports reporters as maybe other leagues are?
That's a great question. And it's been like that, by the way, since the moment I got involved. Like I started in 07, they wouldn't credential me. In 08, they wouldn't credential me. In 09, they only credentialed me towards the end of the year. So it took a long time to get, and like, it was ridiculous. I mean, I have a degree in journalism. I was working for credible outlets, but they just wouldn't do it. And they're still very strict, and they still have this combative relationship with the media. I think it stems from the fact that when they were coming up, very few people were covering them. And, Dana White and company, they took that to heart. And then when they started to have success, it was this feeling like, oh, now you want to cover us, and we're going to tell you, and you can't be critical and all this stuff. Like they want it to be more like pro wrestling in the sense that you don't talk about what's happening behind the curtain. Mm-hmm. And even in pro wrestling, they don't really credential a lot of media to those events. I think they would prefer if they can have their, favorite media guys from their big outlets and then just leave it at that. Obviously, that's, I don't think, the smartest way to go about things, but I just think it stems from the fact, that, in the beginning, they weren't getting covered very much. And then I think they took that to heart. And then when they started getting more popular, they felt like, oh, now we're going to tell you what's what. And so, and now you see, like, I think over the last 4 or 5 years with, the former president and all that stuff, it just became a lot more common to treat media and talk about media in a certain way. And, I think that they share those beliefs.
I wanted to ask you as well a little bit about the concept of objectivity, because that's kind of like, the goal of every journalist is cliche to be objective. So I was wondering if you could tell me what objectivity in sports journalism means in terms of yourself and how you practice it covering mixed martial arts.
Yeah, I love this stuff. I mean, for me, objectivity is, telling it like it is. When I went to Syracuse, I remember one of the first classes I took was journalism ethics, and they taught you things that, you didn't really necessarily think of when you're on the outside looking in, but, not to accept gifts, not to befriend the people who you're supposed to be covering and all this stuff. And so, you look in life, you're going to make relationships, and you're going to have good relationships, you're going to have bad relationships, but it's important as much as possible to not let those relationships affect your coverage, whether the relationships are good or bad. So if you don't have a good relationship with someone, but they do something great, you have to talk about that great thing. And conversely, if you have a good relationship, they do something bad, you have to talk about that bad thing. So that to me is the essence of being objective, telling it like it is, not being biased. This is what kind of drives me nuts about political media.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, in sports media, we're supposed to stay true to these values. And that's, at the end of the day, like, what is sports media? It's pretty inconsequential. It's just an escape for everyone. And then in political media, where, this stuff is real life, you have everyone who's biased. And that goes against every rule of journalism that I've been taught. So I just feel like you have to tell like it is. And ultimately you want, like, I grew up reading a lot about a broadcaster named Walter Cronkite. And Walter Cronkite was known as, at the time, he was the anchor of the CBS Evening News. He was known as the most trusted man in America. And I feel like there's no greater compliment that you can give someone in broadcast journalism than that, where if you say something, the people know that it is legit, it is truthful, it is honest, and it is unbiased. And again, we're human beings, we have feelings, we have emotions, we have relationships. But as much as possible, I would urge everyone to, live by those rules as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I was wondering, getting into, as you kind of touched on some of the ethical issues in journalism, could you touch on some of the ones that you faced? I know you like to talk about the kind of conflict of interest of working for the UFC's broadcasting partners while being expected to cover them objectively as well. Is there anything else that you've encountered where, kind of made you had to think about the ethics of what you were doing at the time?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest one was when I was working for Fox, and they hired me, and then they said, like, we want you to do the pre and post shows and the weigh-ins, which was a dream because I'd never been on TV. And they said, well, but the payment's going to come from the UFC, and that went away. That went against every single rule that I lived by, and it's the biggest regret of my career. Even though I rationalized it in my brain that, like, oh, I was still working for Fox and they were paying the UFC. I wish I never did it, because I knew that it broke that rule. And every year I tried to get them to change it, and they wouldn't. They didn't care enough about me to even really listen to me. So that was a huge one. Working at ESPN brought, a whole new set of challenges, because I was working for ESPN, but in reality, it felt like at times I was being censored and being told to not say certain things, to say certain things, to talk about certain things that I didn't want to talk about, to not talk about things that I wanted to talk about. Like, it was just a huge constant conflict. And I think what I've learned is it's probably best for me not to work for the broadcast partner, unless the sport changes and the way the sport, the way the sport is presented changes. And I'm okay with that. There are enough jobs on the outside looking in. Of course, everyone wants to be on the broadcast and everyone wants, that shine, but I'm honestly okay with it. I'm at peace with it. And And then over the years, there's relationships that you have, there's people that you're close with who then do something that may be controversial or bad, and you have to talk about it. Bad performance, bad fight, bad training camp, say something stupid, and you have to try your best to say something, but you also have to try your best to not ruin a relationship too. Anyone who tells you that that's not a part of the quote unquote job or game is lying to you, because this whole business is about relationships. If you have no relationships, you're not going to go very far. And so the best thing that you can do is not burn those relationships, respect them, but also, get to the point where they respect you enough to where if you say something that's fair, but also critical, they won't end the relationship with you. So that's a tricky dance in its own right. So yeah, I mean, for as long as I'm going to be doing this job, I suspect that I'll be facing these types of issues. But there's a part of me that likes the challenge, and I just love the business of journalism. So, I'm more than willing to take part.
Of course. And kind of on that same topic of conflicts of interest, these conflicts of interest kind of exist everywhere in journalism. I mean, I was just writing a story a couple weeks ago about how the New York Times is sponsored by oil and pharmaceutical companies, and how that kind of influenced their coverage of certain events in some of the things that they were covering. So on that topic, I'm sure you are a fan of independent journalism yourself. How important do you think independent journalism is for the future of media? And do you think that it could ever compete with corporate media in the future, like you've been able to do in the MMA space?
Oh, it's massive. It's gigantic. It's really hard at times to compete because, the other side, they have the pockets, they have everything like that. But if there is no independent journalism, there aren't going to be any truth tellers. Because trust me, I've been on the other side, and it's impossible to tell the truth. That's why I was so eager to go back to Vox, because I knew that they're one of the lone independent outlets left, and that was huge for me. So yeah, it's a really big thing, and I would urge anyone to try out both sides, and you'll probably end. I mean, unless you have a whole different career path in mind, but I think it's a lot more rewarding and a lot more fun to tell the truth. And again, not in a reckless way, not in a vicious way, not in a mean-spirited way, but just to be able to work, whether it's write, talk, behind a microphone, whatever, without having to worry about, relationships, business, and things like that. You can't do the job when you're worrying about that stuff. And that's what I had to worry about at ESPN. And that's why I was so unhappy towards the end. So I'm a big fan of independent journalism, and I hope it's around, and I hope there are outlets, and I hope that, the big corporations don't gobble up all the little guys, because that won't be good for anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of touched on it in your last answer there about, telling the truth in a way that reduces harm. And that's kind of something that we talk about a lot as journalism students, is the concept of harm reduction. Is there an interview that you did ever in your career that you have either decided not to publish, or maybe you did, but you wish that you hadn't shared in hindsight, just because of the harm that it might have caused? I know it's tough for you because you do a lot of live work, so that's not necessarily an option to just take something back. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that question.
There have definitely been a couple of interviews where it gave me pause. Like the first one that comes to mind is when I interviewed Nick Diaz 2 years ago, and he seemed out of it. But if I'm being honest, they took a lot out of that interview, and I wanted to keep it in, because I feel like, listen, you're going to come and talk to me. Like, it's not my job to make you look good. You come, you say, and I will present that in the way in which you said it, but I'm not going to craft something in order to make you look good. So other than that, there haven't really been instances where, there have been some crazy interviews, and there have been some things like, damn, I can't believe this person said it, or I can't believe, they answered this like that. But again, I don't feel like it's my job to do that, to protect them. And luckily, as you said, the vast majority of the stuff that I've done has been live. And so once it's live, you can't really worry about that, right? So, yeah, that's a major reason why I like live very much, because it is what it is. It's out there, and you just have to deal with it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And this is actually my last question here. I wanted to ask you, there's kind of a journalism cliche that you should remove yourself from the story.
Yeah.
But you yourself, you're such a big personality and a draw on your own these days that I would imagine that could get pretty hard. I mean, you look at the Brendan Shaw beef story is one of the biggest MMA stories of the year. It's crazy. So how do you balance being, such a draw in your own right while also, kind of trying to remove yourself from the story and of course make it about the fighters in the end as you do?
Well, you're 100% right. You should not be the story if you're going by the traditional rules. All of that kind of went out the window with the banning thing in 2016. And even that made me very uncomfortable. But honestly, when I got to ESPN, they told me like they want more of my personality. Like the first show that they came up for me was Ariel and the Bad Guy, and there were no guests. It was just me and Chael. And then, on the other shows, and then the DC show and all that stuff. And so they actually cared less about the news and the guests and stuff like that. Like they just wanted to push me, which I appreciated. But that also let me know, like, hey, people like personalities, and journalism is evolving, and there's no real set playbook. Like there are some people who are going to live by that credo, and that's great. But I'd be lying if I didn't say, hey, people seem to like when I show more of my personality, and there are opportunities that come, and it's just fun. Like I'm sitting, like for example, MMA Hour, I'm sitting there for like 3-4 hours. Like if you're going to be, all straight laced for 3-4 hours, it gets kind of boring. So, you look at what other people do, and I think if you're genuine and authentic, and I actually think that people haven't really seen I'm a lot more like the crazy Helwani guy than I am the suit and tie guy. Just going all the way back to my time at Syracuse, it was the suit and tie people that deterred me from sticking around. Like I wanted to be a bit of a renegade. That's why I chose this. So I think people are starting to see a little more of me, and I'm showing a little more. And yeah, it seems like for the most part, people are liking it.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video. If you like our content, be sure to subscribe to Full Man MMA. And while you're at it, make sure to hit the bell icon as well so you never miss an update from us.